being fitted indoor off artificial turf versus outdoor off real turf, the debates raged for years about why you'd want to be fitted outdoors versus indoors, and why indoors has been criticised over the years for being a sterile environment. We're going to take you through each individual element of being fitted and why indoors is as good, if not better, than being fitted outdoors. So the first category we're going to look at is the data. Now, really the key thing to a fitting, to actually knowing what results you're seeing and what benefits and differences there are, is the data. The data validates the testing and helps you see what kind of ball flight changes, ball speed changes, distance developments. Are you getting a benefit from the session itself? Now, any fitter worth their salt is going to use a launch monitor of some description. We use a TrackMan here, and you've got the foresight, you've got the flight scope, you've got several different options that a lot of fitters use. And ultimately, it's the data which is critical. Now, if you're fitting indoors or outdoors, you're using the same equipment. So actually, whilst the conditions change, the way that the machine measures the data is the same. So take the TrackMan, there are 2 radars and a camera in the TrackMan 4 unit. And whilst there's an outdoor and an indoor software application, the only difference is that outdoors, it tracks the whole flight. Indoors, it limits the distance it tracks, but it's measuring the data the same way. So what data points is it getting? The answer is a heck of a lot. So whether it's indoor or outdoors, we have all these different data points that we select some key ones that we use during the fitting, but from club speed, angle of attack, path, dynamic loft, face angle, the list as I scroll through is pretty big, down to some minutiae. So things like you've got the height measurements based on predicted ball flight, whereas outdoors it will measure the whole flight. But because the base parameters are the same, so ball speed, launch angle, spin rate, there are millions of shots worth of data they've collected to develop the algorithms for this, and every year that goes by, it gets more and more and more backup of data to validate where these numbers are. So ultimately, indoors or outdoors, as long as you're using a launch monitor and the fitter is using one that they're familiar with, the quality of the data is just as good. So actually, in that respect, there really isn't any difference. The one place where you might find some data differences will depend on the ball that you're using. So from an indoor fitting, we use the reflective core technology, whether it's Titleist, TaylorMade, Callaway balls, all have this technology in. So either these ones to get the spin and the launch data to really dial in on the exact numbers coming off the ball, or we use some reflective dots to stick on the balls, which if you're using one that doesn't have the RCT, allows us to use the ball that you actually use when you're playing in the fitting. So again, that's really key to getting representative data. So a lot of the time, if you're fitted outdoors, it might be at a range or it might be your golf course range. Unless you're at one of the sort of top 0.1% clubs globally that have Pro V1s on the range, you're going to be using a ball that's not the one that you play. And the data is going to be different. It might be a range ball that you're using, and then some big differences in data. Some of our other videos have shown, particularly in wedges, where this is a massive difference on ball flight. So the one area that we can really dial in on here, in indoors and in the controlled environment, is using the ball that you use on course or an incredibly similar ball to gather the data to validate the results that we're seeing. So in that respect, you could argue slight advantage to indoors. So one of the key things that will vary between fitting indoors and outdoors are the conditions. Definitely don't want to be fitted in that. But obviously indoors, it's a controlled environment. We've got aircon, it's a controlled temperature. We know the surroundings and the conditions that are being fitted in. Whereas outdoors, there are going to be varieties. You get wind. Wind will affect the shot types, the shot patterns, might affect the way that the player develops and moves their swing to account for those, whereas actually indoors, there is none of that. And you could view that both as a positive or a negative, in that there are no conditions to actually show how the player adapts to them. But equally speaking, we want to see almost the truest swing, the most natural, freest swing from the player. And actually, we feel that in this kind of environment, there is no adaptation, no compensation being made. So ultimately, it is the truest movement of that player and the most real swing that we're going to see, because you're not having to manipulate to what's going on outside. Worst case, if you get it for a right-handed player, wind into off the left, it's going to change the way you deliver the club, because we all want to see a nice straight shot. But actually, within those conditions, you've got to manipulate your swing to see that. So ultimately you might not be seeing the truest pattern from that player because they're actually fighting some of the conditions. Now, speaking of the conditions, the other element, temperature. So let's take a look at that side from an indoor situation. So with the TrackMan system that we use, we have the ability to adjust the temperature, altitude settings to where the player potentially is used to playing. However, we don't want to inflate any of the data, so we tend to set it on 0 altitude because ultimately if it goes further out on course by a couple of yards, it's never the worst thing in the world, but we don't want to over expect what the results are going to be. But then there's the temperature element. So this shot here normalized with a temperature of 21 degrees. Now, if you played your golf in Arizona, somewhere so around Las Vegas, Nevada, where it's brutally hot, well, actually what we can do is we can change that temperature. So we go from 21 degrees Fahrenheit, it's extreme, but let's say 40 degrees. If I then go back into here, we started 184.6. That's now 191.1 from a distance point of view. So we have the ability with the TrackMan system to adjust those conditions. Now, this is the case whether it's outdoors or indoors, you can still make those adjustments. But ultimately, the conditions that you're fit in on the day, and this is really the key thing, is indoors it's a controlled environment. We know exactly what we're starting with. We know exactly the temperature. So the aircon sets the environmental temperature. There's no wind, there's no rain. Whereas outdoors, you can get all of the above. You can get wind and rain, and you can get conditions, cold, warm, that actually affect the way the player moves and can create an environment which is requiring more adjustments, more assumptions to be made when you get out on course. Most of us like to play in nice weather. You get a nice spring day when it's, say, 20 odd degrees. It's actually representative to the fitting environment indoors versus if you're early or late in the year, those conditions can be incredibly different. So we're now going to talk about the big one that you're all clearly waiting for to talk about, artificial turf versus real turf. Now, there's a strong argument that people make is that if you're hitting off mats, you don't hit off mats on the golf course. So actually off turf is the truest way to be tested and to be fitted from. However, there is a little caveat to this, and there's a strong argument. I totally understand that point of view as well. You're playing off real grass and real turf, so really what is the relevance of a mat? So the launch and spin varies very slightly off the mat, and there is no mat that perfectly mimics what turf does. They're trying really hard to do it, but there isn't one out there currently that gives you exactly the same conditions because turf comes out, the soil breaks, the top surface breaks through, so we're not going to get that off a mat. So absolutely that is the case. However, has anyone ever thought that the bit of turf that you're fitted off isn't what you then go and play off? So you're not cutting out that piece of turf and taking it to every shot you hit and playing off that piece of turf. What you're doing is the turf you're hitting off is only specific to that point in time. So you might be playing at the same course, but if it rains overnight, well, the ground conditions are different. So the ball flight changes. So you go to a different course, the turf's different. You go to a different country, the turf's different. So actually, day to day, hour to hour, in some cases, if you get range, conditions change. The conditions you're actually playing off, the ground conditions, the mat conditions, the strike surface you're using is different. It's different winter to summer. Rock hard as we get here in the UK, rock hard in summer versus a wet clay in winter. Totally different ground conditions. So really, what the mat does, it gives us an absolute, it gives us a known quantity. So we know the conditions we're hitting off day in, day out, shot to shot, hour to hour. They're static. So you're not getting that point of change. You're not getting those differentials that actually require even more layers of interpretation every time you go out on them. In here, yes, we have to interpret shot data, we have to interpret swings, but we're not having to interpret what the interaction with the mat is because it's the same day to day. So whilst I totally understand the viewpoint that turf is best because it's real, there is a counter argument to it. Why, again, the control environment, and remember with fitting, we've got to fit to the median, we've got to fit to the average, but then make allowances for the extremes. So as I say, in the UK, we get very firm in summer. If it's a clay surface, it bakes out and gets like rock, and then in winter it gets wet and it goes soggy as heck, and it's horrible turf to play off. So we have to look at all the conditions and make allowances for that. It's not just where you're fitted on the day. Now we're going to go on to wedges because this is another very, very strong point that people make about why off turf versus mats is better, but we've got another point of view for you. Now, wedges. This is the big one. This is the one that we get the most comments on and gets the most, I think, emotive response from people watching about fitting for wedges off artificial turf, indoors versus outdoors. So again, as with the full swing data, it's the same data. Whether you use whichever launch monitor you're using, if it's off a mat or if it's off turf, the way it measures and the type of data that it measures is the same. We're still fitting using specific wedge lofts, specific shafts to test for gapping and distances. So that side is exactly the same. As with the full swing clubs, there are some minor differences in launch and spin off mats. It will launch a little higher and spin a little less off a mat. Just due to there being that little bit of give in the surface, it strikes slightly higher up the face in the majority of instances. However, some of the turfs that you play off, if it's a lusher, thicker turf and it sits up a little bit more, actually it can be more similar to off a mat than some of the turfs over here where it's fine leaf and it sits down to the ground. So again, outdoors you've got those variations in turf that actually, unless you're hitting off the same specific bit of turf, it's going to vary round to round. If you think, the players themselves, the tour players, what they will do is when they're going off to tournaments, they will dial in every single club, distance-wise, flight-wise, so they know off the specific turf they're playing off that week, how it differs from the last week. You get grain of grass, things like that will affect some of the turf interaction that you just can't mimic anywhere other than in that specific situation. So as with the full swing clubs, it's only specific to the conditions on that day that you're playing in. But wedge bounce is the one that we really need to address. I think this is the one that, I think from a full swing data, most players will accept that there's very little difference. Wedge bounce and how you fit for that is the one that I think has the most questions. So how do we look at the shape of the sole, the amount of bounce when you're not playing off turf? Well, one thing I will say is turf is less forgiving. So certainly if you're playing off a piece of grass with soil underneath and you go in a little steep to it, off a mat it can bounce a little bit, it'll bounce up into the ball and maybe kind of create almost like a kind of a drop kick kind of strike. Off turf, you dig that leading edge into the turf, it kills it dead and the ball goes about 3 feet. So yes, turf is definitely going to show up technical deficiencies a little bit more clearly than you're going to get off a mat. However, we still need to look at which bit of the sole are you using, what's your technique, what's your angle of attack. All these data points that the TrackMan or whichever launch monitor you use will give you and can help you determine where low point is, how deep does someone go, what's your path, what's your face angle. It doesn't matter whether it's off a mat or turf, you can get those numbers from a good launch monitor. But how do we determine the right bounce profile? Well, let's have a little bit of a look at that based on the turf and the systems that we use here. So, those of you that are seeing this on the floor will recoil at the fact that we may even consider using this. However, this is not for lie. We don't use it for lie. We use a chalk line on the ball to leave a mark on the face that tells us whether the lie is correct or not. So we do not use this for lie, but we do use this for strike point interaction. So one of the things that we don't have the luxury of indoors is seeing a divot come out of the ground when someone strikes a wedge shot. So we have to find a way of looking at the strike point on the sole of the wedge to look at bounce and suitability for sole shape. So if I put the ball back in my stance and get steep on it and deliver a stronger angle of attack, what we get from this is we get a nice mark along the front of the wedge. So we can see if I get the angle forward, it shows us where the strike point, the major strike point, the bit that's taking the brunt of the force of the turf, where that is. Now, if I open the club up and play kind of a cut-up shot around the greens, so my own sort of game, I do open the club a lot, bunkers and things, someone may play this shot, and I work the club underneath. What we get is, as you can see, very back edge of that tape there is right on that back point. So we've completely moved the strike point with the way I've utilized the head. So what you get on turf is you can look at the depth, you can look at where the start point is, toe or heel, you can look at the toe down, heel down, you can look at actually the way it works through, you can listen to the contact. Now we can still listen to the contact off this bit of mat, Or to mimic a firmer turf, we can actually play short wedge shots off this bit. It's a much tighter, firmer piece of turf as well. But we need to see the bit of the sole that is taking the brunt of the contact to know how we need to shape that sole based on someone's delivery. So these are the two extreme ends of the type of shots that I would play. But what we've got with these is I can see that it's not right on the leading edge. So we know that I'm safe from that leading edge contact if I get a little bit steeper onto it. And when I crank it open, because the contact's late, we know that back edge needs to get out the way. So what this pattern tells us is how I use the wedge, which bits I deliver to the turf, and how we need that sole to shape in order to give me the consistency and the versatility of shots, and to give us that visual. And also it can help to educate the player and help them to see why you're using a certain bounce shape and which one is actually more consistent. From a standard shot, we want a nice wide mark across the center, and the right bounce will give consistency and help that club head through the turf. And actually, as much as it's derided, when you don't have turf to hit off, it is a great picture to use to show how that sole interacts with the turf to help work out the best bounce for you. And there's one last piece that we're going to look at with regard to turf. It's about the type of mat that you use. So the type of mat that you use, and there are broad variations on this. We use it's a Southwest surface, it's Pro T, and it's the same that Titleist use in their fitting centres. But what you can see from this is the amount of pile to base. There's vast amount of pile and just a very sort of small base section here. So what that means is that give is in it moves. So again, to try to mimic turf as much as possible, we want the surface to move with the stripe, because that's what grass does. As I said earlier, there's no piece of artificial turf that perfectly mimics actual turf. But what this means is you've got that little bit of give. One, it protects joints, but it also means that it moves with the contact and mimics it as best as possible. What you don't want is the opposite, where you've got this much rubber and then just a small piece of felt on the top, because what then happens is you get a lot of shock into your joints and the club literally bounces off. So you could argue, does it mimic kind of rock hard summer turf? Potentially. However, the club head literally stops in that top surface rather than moving through it like it would on turf. So having a good quality mat to hit off where there's that bit of give and a nice sort of thick pile, that's really critical to representative results. So the final piece of the puzzle is the facility. By having an indoor facility, yes, we've got the controlled environment. We also have an awful lot of wall space to have the equipment, the shafts, the workshop on site, the loft line machines, all the bits of equipment that we need to dial the spec in. If, for example, if a tip breaks, we can take it next door, fix it straight away. We can bend the loft line, your irons right there and then. We can make a swing weight change. We can do a wedge grind. All that is on site here, ready to go, ready to use, and it's at our fingertips to make those adjustments as required. It's much harder to do that in a remote setting. Yes, if you've got a big tour van the same size that you see at the events, that gives you that space required. However, that's actually really quite hard to do. Most fitters will not have that facility. And even then, you're probably looking at restricted options, half a dozen, maybe 10 shaft options. We've got hundreds on the wall here. So the advantage of a fixed facility is everything's here. There's multiple options in some instances. Everything's to hand. There's no compromise on from a build point of view, or actually say being able to make a simple change, like switching a grip over mid-fit to a bigger size. We use an air compressor for that, and we can do that right here. So all of those bits that actually are quite hard to take out remotely is very easy to build into an indoor facility where it's all to hand and it's all fixed. So there's definitely a big advantage there. So to round up, ultimately there are going to be players who will only want to be fitted outdoors, and there'll be players that are perfectly comfortable being fitted indoors, and that's absolutely fine. It's the player's choice to where they go. But I think what we feel, and I think what we're able to display doing this sort of video, is that actually there are no real compromises to be made. In some respects, you could argue that outdoors, the fitter and the skill of the fitter has to make more compensations and interpretations, because there is no perfect environment day in, day out outdoors. You're always changing the conditions, whereas in here, it's the same every day. It's the same surface we're hitting off. It's the same data sets, the same balls types that we're using. There are less interpretations required. There are always going to be interpretations based on the player, where they play, the shots they like to hit. But if you can minimize those, you can focus on the bits that really matter. And that's really the fitter's skill, is doing that, is getting the player optimized with clubs based on how they play their game, where they play, the types of conditions they play in regularly. But if you're not having to make allowances for what's happening on the day, then from our point of view, it means there's one less thing to worry about. We can really focus on what's working for the player, given the scenarios that they're telling us about, rather than having to make allowances, say, well, actually it would normally go further because we're into winter day. It's not really something we want to be doing. But I hope that what this shows you is that indoor fitting is at least as good as outdoors, and in some instances, we feel just a little bit better. And I know there'll be lots of comments on this, and in some respects I hope there are lots of comments on this, because I think it's something that there's a lot of divisive comments out there, but ultimately the skill of the fitter and the ability for the fitter to interpret how the equipment works for the player is the most important thing. No matter where you're fitted, the club's working for you and they're helping you make your game better. So if you'd like to see a bit more about how we do things, check out this fitting video. You see how it happens in actually real time, the process of the fitting and how we work it, and hit the like button, subscribe. We'll look forward to seeing you again next time.